Hello, my name is Doug Drossman, and I'm really pleased to be able to give this keynote presentation on the history of these disorders and the history of IFFGD. This is pretty important to me since I've been around a while, since the beginning of IFFGD and maybe the beginning of a lot of the more modern aspects of the functional GI disorders going back about 40 years. So I'm at University of North Carolina and Rome Foundation, and I have my own practice. And let me begin by telling you about the history. It was Josh Billings who said in the 1800s, a good set of bowels is worth more to a man than any quantity of brains. Now, to begin this history, I think we have to understand historically the way the concepts of illness and disease have modulated over time. We talk about illness as the person's perception of ill health, the way they feel. We talk about disease as objective measurement or evidence like endoscopy or X-ray. And the way people see illness and disease depends on belief systems or what we call explanatory or folk models of the time. And as science moves on, it reinforces certain concepts and eliminates others. For example, the concepts of psychogenesis, that psychiatric factors cause these GI disorders, or biomedical reductionism or mind-body dualism, has been replaced by a more integrated biopsychosocial model. So in Western civilization, there was an interaction between the mind, between mind and body relating to two competing concepts. Holism was the concept that unifies mind and body, and dualism separates mind and body. It was over 2,000 years ago when Plato and later Aristotle and Hippocrates said the greatest mistake in the treatment of disease is that there are physicians for the body and physicians for the soul, but the two cannot be separated. That concept in Western civilization was critical, and then it evolved over the next few centuries, hundreds of years, to a point where dualism came into place, and this was in the 1637 by René Descartes. Now, up until this point, the body couldn't be examined as related to medicine because the spirit was thought to reside in the body. There was holism. And so medicine was really based on symptoms, examination of urine and the like. But when René Descartes separated the machine-like body, res extensa, with the thinking mind, res cogitans, the mind was lifted out of the body, the spirit and the mind was lifted and was now separate from the body, so the body could be dissected. And what that led to was more than 300 years of science relating to morphologic examination of the human body, pathology, histopathology, X-ray, endoscopy, and the like. But back then, when people had symptoms that couldn't be explained by morphology, they were stigmatized. They were thought to be possessed. And later, they were thought to be insane. And these patients who had behavioral abnormalities or unexplained symptoms went into the insane asylums. And in fact, science wasn't even allowed at that time, actually until about the 20th century when the mental health was added to the curriculum in medical schools from the ideas of Benjamin Rush. Now, it was 10 years ago that when I gave a keynote at the IFFGD meeting, that I said the concept of separation of mind and body is dominant and pervasive in Western thinking, and this has had negative effects on research, patient care, and the patient-physician relationship. What I mean by that is when we think about these disorders, we often in medicine separate disease, which is the verifiable or organic aspects, the machine-like body, from the patient's perception of ill health or the illness. Now, from a hierarchical standpoint, this is what's considered legitimate And this is always under question. You can't validate the patient's experience of illness, only the objective measures. And that's led to uh, these functional GI disorders, which don't have structural bases, as be considered second class. Now, the fact is that we learn in medical school to diagnose disease, but patients come to us with illness, as shown here. And in this study by Kurt Kroenke in 1989, when you look at the top 10 symptoms brought to a primary care clinic, an organic condition was found in only about 10% of the patients coming. So while we want to diagnose disease, we're often working with illness. And if we create a grid of the degree of disease and the degree of illness, as shown here, you can see that when you have illness and disease, you have what's called rightful suffering, COPD, cancer, and the like. When you have the absence of both, you have health. But when you have illness in the absence of verifiable disease, you're often considered to be psychosomatic or functional. And that's where these disorders tend to be. George Engel, one of my mentors, was an internist and psychoanalyst. And in 1977, in his seminal publication in Science, identified the concept of the biopsychosocial model, which was really an integration of understanding illness and disease from biologic, psychosocial, and biologic and psychosocial parameters, and we'll talk about that later. Going back a few hundred years, we have to see how GI physiology emerged, because GI physiology underpins a lot of our understanding of these disorders. 1,000 years ago, Moses Maimonides said man should strive to have his intestines relaxed all the days of his life. So even then, they recognized that abnormally functioning intestines create problems. Now, if we go back to 1822, William Beaumont, who was a general in the army, studied a soldier named Alexis St. Martin. He was shot in battle and developed a gastric fistula. And he did experiments on this and noted that milk coagulated when he took it out of the stomach. And he also noted that the stomach was churning. And this led to the understanding of acid secretion and of digestion. A little bit later, Walter Cannon studied cats and looked at the effect of stress. And he found that when cats were stressed by a growling dog, and they were seen on X-ray doing a barium study, they had reduced intestinal motility. So fear and stress led to reduced motility. Later came Ivan Pavlov, who, as you know, taught about the conditioned response. And one of the conditioned responses was secretion when seeing food. And Pavlov learned that if he cut the vagus nerve, he abolished the gastric acid secretion. And this was the cephalic phase of acid secretion, again, showing how the brain could be affecting GI function. Moving up to the 1940s, Stuart Wolfe, shown here, and his patient Tom in the background, was studying physiologic experiments on Tom, who at age 9 burned his esophagus with clam chowder, and the surgeons at New York Hospital performed one of the first gastrostomies. So Tom fed himself for the next 65 years of his life. And Wolfe noted the way the stomach mucosa looked under stress. Overwhelming stressful situations leading to symptoms of fear led to pallor and reduced motility in the stomach, similar to Cannon's experiment. But challenging situations that made the patient frustrated or angry led to reddening and increased secretion and increased motility, similar to when anticipating food. Next came Hans Sallier, who studied the effects of stress on the body, called the general adaptation syndrome. And he found that stress, in addition to producing adrenal enlargement, cause gastric erosions. Tom Almy, one of my mentors in the 70s, was a gastroenterologist who did studies on human subjects, and he looked at the effects of stress on colonic motility. One of the studies was done with medical students, perhaps before IRB and permissions, but he did an experiment with medical students where he was doing a sigmoidoscopy with the medical student in the knee chest position, and he implied to the student that there was a cancer present in the sigmoid colon, and he looked at the contractile state of the bowel, and you can see it went up. He even faked taking a biopsy of the colon by putting a piece of potato in a jar of formalin and showed it to the student, and the contractility went up until the hoax was explained. George Engel again did some work with the effects of emotion and physiologic expression in personality development. And this was Monica, who was studied. She had an esophageal fistula and was tube fed. And he studied her into her 40s doing videotapes and interviews. And one of the things he found was that the way she held her grandchild was not cuddling the child, but holding the child out. And then he had videos of her when she had her baby, her first child, doing the same thing. And then at age 6, when holding a doll, held it out. And when he asked her why she did that, she said it just didn't feel natural to hold it close. And he went back to show how this young lady, as a baby, was not held or cuddled, but was tube fed from a distance. Again, showing how early factors can affect development. Bill Whitehead, a collaborator of mine and a good friend, promoted around 1990 the concept of visceral hypersensitivity, along with other investigators such as Joel Richter in the esophagus and others. And his promoting of visceral hypersensitivity began to move us away from motility being the full explanation for these disorders. Here's one of his studies in 1990 showing that when you do rectal distension, you can get an increase in pain reporting in normals, but a greater response in IBS. And this was after adjusting for motility. It was again established that stimulus can increase motility in IBS, leading to greater response. So we had two factors: increased motor reactivity and increased sensitivity of the bowel in response to various stressors. So we've taken you through the physiology. Let's talk about the concept of looking at symptoms, not in terms of specific symptoms of diarrhea and constipation, but as syndromes, that is, entities like IBS. That meant developing symptom clusters that categorize clinical entities. Now, one of the earliest descriptions of a syndromic entity was Richard Powell's report of 4 women with occasional pain in the intestines and derangement of their powers of digestion with flatulence and a sense of suffocation. Maybe a better description was a Cumming, who reported that the bowels are at one time constipated, at another time lax in the same person. How the disease has two such different symptoms, I do not profess to explain. Back in 1962 was the first compilation or studies of a group of patients that he called irritable colon syndrome. There are 130 cases, and what was unique about this case series was it was the first description of subcategorization of diarrhea predominant and constipation predominant. And he also identified that about 23% of the patients began their IBS or irritable colon with a dysentery or an infection. So here's the first reported case of post-infection IBS. Now into the 80s, pharmaceutical companies were looking to do treatment trials. The FDA was looking for ways to make a diagnosis But there was no way in the early 80s. It was done by exclusion. In fact, Ken Klein had done some work at the time to show that there was not one consistent way to identify a patient for clinical trials. You'd have an IBS study with someone with diarrhea, someone with constipation, someone with pain and no bowel movement. So there was no ability, and so diagnosis was made by an exclusion, which meant it was not cost effective. There was no limit to the number of studies you could do. In the late 80s, Aldo Torsoli, who was the professor in gastroenterology at the University of Rome, became president of the International Congress of Gastroenterology in Rome, and he came up with the idea of setting up working teams which bring together consensus documents by experts from around the world using what's called the Delphi approach, where individuals would work together to come to consensus. And the first one to be done for the GI disorders was for IBS, and that was to develop diagnostic criteria by consensus. And that was through the Delphi method. Now, the other thing that advanced our work was that of looking at certain academic and educational societies. The first came out in 1979. Around the 1990 came IFFGD, and I'll say more about this later. But to encapsulate it, Nancy Norton, who was a patient and a patient advocate, had a mission to develop a patient-focused nonprofit organization. She worked hand in hand with Bill Norton, who was the secretary treasurer. And originally, this was the International Foundation for Bowel Disorders, focusing on bowel problems and fecal incontinence. And then Nancy was looking to make a difference, to reduce the stigma seen with these patients, to educate physicians, and to be a resource for patients. But she became engaged with the FBG and later on with other organizations, and came to meetings and collaborated. This became the International Foundation for Functional GI Disorders to cover a broader spectrum in '96, and then the International Foundation for Gastrointestinal Disorders in 2018 to cover non-functional GI disorders such as GERD, gastroparesis, and the like. And so they expanded, they did professional meetings, patient educational material, more about that later. And their mission was to inform, assist, and support people affected by GI disorders. Nancy retired about 2 to 3 years ago, and we welcomed Cecile Rooker, who was actually the executive director of the Rome Foundation, working very closely with me to helping build the organization. And then she left our organization, became the executive director of IFFGD in 2017, president in 2018, and the rest is history with the accomplishments she is doing now. This was an organization, as we said, that began with Nancy and Bill. I remember in 1992, Grant Thompson and I were at DDW, and we went to the exhibitor area and saw Nancy and Bill behind this table, the International Foundation. We said, "Who are you?" And we had a wonderful discussion, and we brought them to the first FBG meeting, and the rest after that was the growth of their organization. And this was done very methodically. And let me take you through the years. They were founded in '91. The first thing they wanted to do was to have a call center to answer patient questions. They produced a magazine. They began their collaborations with other organizations. In 1995, they produced the first of 10 biennial international symposia that brought in 400 to 600 people, very remembered by all of us who were there. It was a networking program. It brought in clinicians, students, scientists, pharmaceutical industry, regulatory agencies, and the like. Very meaningful. And actually, this symposium is very similar to that. They changed their name in 1996. They developed slide sets and guidebooks. In 1997, they developed their website. The website opened up for IBS, constipation, gastroparesis. They began IBS Awareness Month through Congress. They developed educational videos. They then designated GERD Awareness Week. The first public service announcement was shown on television. All of this was instituted by Nancy and Bill. They began to work more with GERD. They then began NIH-sponsored programs on fecal and urinary incontinence, which continued to the present time. By 2002, Nancy was testifying at the House Appropriations Committee to increase NIH funding, and it continued every year after. They published a very large and meaningful survey called IBS in the Real World, which had impact on FDA and Congress. They began the first research awards in 2003, which have continued. They developed a consensus conference. They submitted written testimony to the US and Senate appropriations for funding. Another survey was done. They began to go to the media by creating a reporter's guide. They drafted and proposed the Functional GI and Motility Disorders Research Enhancement Act and put this bill into Congress, and that's been promoted every year since. As we see here, introduced in 2013, they then began Advocacy Day, where they brought scientists and clinicians to Washington to go door to door to the Congress and to speak on these disorders. And then they started a research program of giving awards. And then in 2014, Nancy received the Lifetime Service Achievement Award by the Digestive Disease National Coalition. In 2015, more about the Research Enhancement Act. They gave more testimony. They set up Gastroparesis Awareness Month. Then they report the Reporter's Guide. In 2017, Nancy retired as president and Cecile came on. And things have continued. The advisory committee, the Latin Ambassador Program, an educational series, and an Advocacy Connection newsletter. Since I was on the board until about 2 years ago, I decided to contact my former board associates and ask them to say a few words. Nancy Norton founded IFFGD with a dedication to people often suffering alone who needed clear and accurate information about GI health. She and Bill devoted their lives to growing an organization of integrity, advocacy, broad reach, unlike any other, that continues to assist people around the world. Michael Cohen talked about how she developed the organization from a grassroots operation from her home to an international known organization. Nancy Hartman talked how she possessed the highest degree of integrity of any business leader, and they were specifically recognized and lauded by industry for consistently maintaining complete absence of bias. Jeanette Trees talked from their personal experience in coping with life-altering GI disorders. They channeled their isolation, frustration, and pain into a quest to find solutions, inform, and give support. So Nancy and Bill, I want to thank you for all you have done to advance education and legitimize the field for our patients.